I should like to start by thanking the trustees of the Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Vastu Sangrahalaya for the great honor they've done me in inviting me to give this year's Coomaraswamy Lecture. And also, if I may, to thank the trustees, Mr. Mukherjee, and the colleagues in this house for allowing me over the last 10 years to work with them on a number of projects which have certainly changed the way I think about the world, and of which this is the latest one. It is, as Mr. Mukherjee suggested, a project of which we hope Coomaraswamy himself would have approved. One of his greatest achievements was to open the enjoyment and the understanding of Indian art to the publics of Europe and America. And in some measure, we've been hoping in this exhibition to do something in the other direction, to allow a new generation of young Indians to enjoy, to understand, to look at, to spend time with the art of the Mediterranean. Where Coomaraswamy did his work mostly by texts, we have decided to focus entirely on things. And there are a number of very good reasons for that. But the fact that it was a decision that we would do it through things led to some marvelous moments a few weeks ago. When presents start arriving wrapped up in crates, it's always a fairly exciting moment. And this was the moment when the gods from Berlin arrived in Mumbai. And it really did feel a bit like a birthday, I think, for everybody, as the crates were opened and the contents were revealed. Here, this little Dionysus, of which you'll be hearing a little more later on. Here, the torso of Apollo, magnificent male torso, being released from the captivity of the case and slowly manhandled on to the elevation of the plinth. I don't think many gods are treated in this way. And it was wonderful to watch slowly these great objects from other houses coming to take their place here in the Rotunda. And the Aphrodite, the Venus from Berlin, looking, I think, a little surprised at where she'd found herself and looking at these slightly doubtful characters all around as she stood unprotected on the floor until she was luckily elevated to a plinth, and the final purpose of the whole exercise was achieved, that Mr. Mukherjee, whom you see here, was seen to smile. At that stage, we knew everything was going to be all right. And the next stage, and really for all of us, I think the culmination, came yesterday morning, the first fully operational working day, weekday, when the school children arrived and started looking at the works from the British Museum, from Berlin, and from the Getty Museum that had been brought for them, precisely for them, to look at and to study. Because this is the purpose of the whole thing. Why did we want to bring things to India in order to address the art of the ancient Mediterranean? Largely because for many of the young Indians, and there are something like 700 million Indians under the age of 25, many of them will not be able to travel to see these objects in other countries. If we want an understanding of those ancient cultures to grow here, we need to bring the things. Because although India's museums are very rich, they're not rich in objects of this sort. So these objects are going to be here to be looked at, studied, understood, enjoyed for 10 months, much longer than usual, so that they can really become part of the public conversation, the discussion here in Mumbai. This exercise has, as Mr. Mukherjee mentioned, been a great international partnership. And the objects have come from the Getty Museum, the villa in California, a replica of the great villa in Pompeii, which is where the classical antiquities, the Mediterranean antiquities, are housed in the Getty Museum. From Berlin, the Antikensammlung in the Altes Museum. And here there's one thing that should have made Aphrodite feel a little bit more at home here, because in the middle of her museum in Berlin is also a rotunda with a dome, so she should feel not too out of place. And from the British Museum, where I think she would certainly have been used to the crowds. This partnership of 4 museums is something completely new. The four museums together, the curators, decided to think how to present this material, how to choose the material, and how to show it. And the whole project was funded by the inspired generosity of the Getty Trust under its current leader, Catherine Fleming, but above all by the original enthusiasm, the original idealism of her predecessor, Jim Cuno. We wanted to bring things for a very particular reason, because there's always a danger that if you study through texts, you wind up with an abstract history, a history of ideas which is hard to remember. It's the things that let you not only enjoy the beauty of the civilization, but also the history through which those things have gone and which explains why they are, how they are now, and where they are. I just want to give you one example of why we felt the focus on bringing great works of art, great things, was the way to address this. You're looking at a statue from Berlin, a statue of the Triton. Triton is one of the rather rare figures in Greek and Roman mythology, who is a composite human and animal, in this case half man, half fish. The seaweed you see at his bottom conceals the fact that he's turning into a fish for his lower half. He's the son of Poseidon, the sea god, and the queen of the sea, so to speak, Amphitrite. And he's probably Greek, and probably about 350 BCE. And a perfect example of that wonderful Greek ability to carve and capture the male torso in a moment of exertion and indeed exhilaration. The more you look, the more you find to admire. And details that you can't really see on the internet or in a photograph, like the fact that the hair is quite clearly wet hair. This is somebody just emerging from the sea with his hair absolutely still filled with water and looking upwards. And when you look at the face, you can see another reason why we wanted to bring the objects, because this is the perfect example of how the object is its own document. It's very rare to find Triton shown on his own, and it would be surprising if this were indeed meant as a self-standing sculpture. But if you look at the face, you can see, I hope, that around above the brow, above the eyebrows, and round the side of his face, there is an incrustation crystallized of what looks like limestone, lime water with lime. It suggests that this figure was clearly for a long time deluged regularly by limey water. In fact, it suggests that he was once part of a fountain. And if you look round the back, you see something a little unexpected. That large square black mark in the top left is a dowel hole. And as you can see, the back of the statue is not worked at all. He was clearly meant to be fixed onto something else and then deluged with water. The obvious explanation would be a fountain. And to give you an idea of what we think now might have been the sort of thing that he was part of in antiquity, I remind you of the Trevi fountain in Rome, that great 18th century fountain built, of course, to be the end of a Roman aqueduct, where you can see in the center Poseidon, the king of the sea, and the Tritons left and right drawing his chariot. And here you can see, I think, a figure that is clearly the kind of thing our Triton could have been, blowing his conch, drawing Poseidon in his royal triumph through the seas. It's the sort of information that you only get by looking at the object. And it's a kind of scholarship that seems to all of us extremely important, not just because it tells you why the thing was made in the first place, but what happened to it subsequently and why it now looks the way it does. But this object tells you something else about its history. If you return to that view of the back of the Triton, because on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see letters and a number. And those are written in Cyrillic, in the Russian alphabet. Because in 1945, one of the first things the Soviets did after the conquest of Berlin was to remove all the antique sculptures from the museums of Berlin. In May 1945, astonishingly, within weeks of the end of the war, this object and all the other sculptures from the Altes Museum were put on trains and taken to Moscow. And there they were given an accession number to make them part of the Soviet collections as reparation for war damages. In 1958, when East Germany, the German Democratic Republic, was set up, the Soviet Union decided to return the sculptures to Berlin so that East Berlin would be able to compete with the paintings which had mostly remained in West Berlin. The back of this statue tells you a great deal about empires, what happens in war, what happens after war, and the politics that shape the movement and the understanding of the objects. And finally, it is, as you will all see, a remarkably beautiful thing. That was one of our purposes in bringing things, and one of our purposes in this joint exercise of co-curation, to choose objects that had not just great aesthetic quality, but particular narratives, particular facts that would open conversations in all kinds of other directions. But we had, of course, another purpose, and perhaps an even bigger one. And that was to open the possibility of looking at the art of the Mediterranean, not from Europe, as has usually been the case, but from India. Indeed, to change the way in which the map of the world is conceived and what that means for the way we understand our culture and the cultures of others. Most of us grew up with a map like this. And it is, of course, a map constructed by the Europeans at the moment when it was agreed that the longitude, the meridian of 0 would run through Greenwich, through London. A decision accepted by the whole world, except, unsurprisingly, the French, who for a very long time refused to acknowledge this. The Paris meridian was on their maps, but to the rest of the world, there's not a great deal of difference. But it does, of course, show the way most of us were taught to imagine the world, with Europe in the middle and at the top in the representation, as indeed in our mental maps about the way the world was structured. We all know this is no longer, this is a moment, this is no longer the way any of us would now envisage the world in anything other than a map. And that idea of rethinking the map of the world so that different places are at the center has been going on for almost a century. And one of the examples that I most enjoy is this wonderful Raja Ravi Varma image of the late 19th century, where Vishnu as Varaha is rescuing Bhudevi, the goddess of the earth, but not rescuing her as a goddess, but as a globe. A globe, quite a recent innovation at the time. And you will see, I hope, that in that globe, India is at the middle. This is an image of the world with India in the middle. And that's what we've been trying to do, to look at the world from India and how does the ancient Mediterranean impinge on India? How does it look from it? And that means rethinking what is said about the objects and opening lots of questions for the future about what will be said about them from now on. The bit of the world we're looking at is effectively this. It's what you see on the map before you, the white line going around the colored area, is the empire of Alexander at its peak. running from northern Greece and Egypt right the way through to the Indus, including the whole of Iran. It's the moment that the Europeans took as a starting point and indeed an end point, and in particular the boundary of the Indus. The fact that Alexander stopped there, as you all know, has astonishingly still got repercussions in the way the museum collections in Paris and Berlin are shown. The collections of the ancient world in the Louvre that embrace the whole of the Mediterranean stop at the Indus. The Indian collections are in another museum, the Musée Guimet. In Berlin, the same. The Antikensammlung, the Altes goes all the way to Iran, and then everything in India is part of the Asian Art Museum. A difference, a distinction, a boundary that has had, I think, very, very serious consequences in the way each side thinks of the shared history. And it was, of course, that boundary that Coomaraswamy was in many ways trying to overcome. And it's also that boundary that this exhibition and the continuing project over the next 3-4 years is, we hope, going to be able to address, to argue that this is not the limit of the narrative, that the Indian story is part of this story, and telling the story of the area on the map from India is the challenge for future historians. That's the ambition of the whole project. In physical terms, it has meant that we decided to put at the heart of the exhibition Indian objects, an Indian object, to look at the objects from the Eastern Mediterranean through the prism of India. And in the center of the Rotunda, this magnificent statue of the Yagnavaraha, made somewhere around the year 1000. Varaha, Vishnu in his form as a boar, rescuing the earth, goddess Bhudevi, as you see. A monumental, powerful, moving object demonstrating the divine intervention that will rescue and change the world. It is a wonderfully complex object. It's made to assist to represent ritual offerings, and on the body of the boar are the cosmic deities, 350 of them, that need to be present for the ritual offerings to be properly made. And on the snout of the boar is Saraswati, the goddess of wisdom, that this is one of the ways in which divine wisdom operates and links heaven and earth. It's this subject, which of course was exactly the same as the one that Ravi Varma was illustrating before, and it's the whole world that is being rescued. That's what we want to address. The head of the Varaha points in the Rotunda towards the Indian Sculpture Gallery, which has been magnificently reordered, rethought, and represented by Vandana Prapana and her colleagues to provide the Indian basis from which the visitor can look at what is happening in the Rotunda. And as you approach it, you're greeted by the statues representing the three great Indian religious traditions of Buddhism, Jainism, and in the center is the figure of Shiva, of Sadashiva. And it's quite a good place, I think, for us to start in terms of trying to link the narratives of India and the rest, because it seems to me that it epitomizes that idea that Indian sculpture of the gods is very much about an idea. The three faces of Shiva that we can see here, the peaceful contemplative Shiva looking forward, who represents also the air in the center. On the left, the forceful, violent Shiva, and on the right, the peaceful, smiling, rather feminine Shiva. The different aspects of the god the different aspects of humanity, the different elements of the cosmos, are all combined in an image which has nothing to do with naturalism, but everything to do with an intellectual process given brilliant material form. If you stand in a certain position, you can look at the Sadashiva and then compare it with the Greek father god, almost certainly Zeus. And you already see an extraordinary difference in the starting point of Greece and Rome, the Greco-Roman world, and the Indian one, without very much needing to be said. The fact that this is a totally human figure, brilliantly carved, the carving of the beard and the hair merits very close examination, but a figure which could be almost a portrait, the authority given by the high hair and the broad features, but the notion that the divinity can be approached and represented only through a human body of a particularly elevated sort. And that means that at any one moment you can look at only one aspect of the divine, where in the Sadashiva you can see all the aspects together and combine the concepts. This is not possible in the Greek and Roman tradition. And this difference is something that I think you can see all the way through. But we wanted, as I say, always to start from the Indian familiar through which to look at the rest and see how it looks when comparing it with what Indians think, expect, imagine in the context of their gods, compared with ancient Egypt or Greece and Rome. Very much, I think, the way that Coomaraswamy addressed similar topics. And if we stand at this angle from beside the Varaha, we look straight over to Hapi, the god of the inundation of the Nile, whom you can see standing behind him. The Varaha was made for ritual offerings to ensure the proper ordering and balance of the cosmos. The god Hapi is the god of the flooding of the Nile, that flood on which Egypt depended completely for the survival of its population. And this god is shown with an offering table in front of him. Both statues are about offerings. And on the front of the statue, you can see, and on the sides, you can see the birds and the fruits, which are the result of the inundation that are being offered by Hapi about 900 BCE to the gods. It's one of those universal phenomena, the river without which life is impossible, water without which life is impossible, has to be regarded as divine, has to be thanked with offerings as we keep reminding ourselves of our dependence on it. And both these objects, the Varaha and the Hapi, are very powerful in that regard. If you look more closely when you're inside, you'll see on the right-hand side as you look at it, the image of the donor in prayer, offering himself as his gift to Hapi and to the gods of the Nile. This is an idea that I think is fairly familiar, fairly easy for any Indian visitor, because the idea of the divine river, in this case, we put on the banner beside it, this image of Ganga from about 500 CE, will be well known to any Indian as an indication of the fact that we depend on the river. The river has its own divine personality, and without it, we can't survive. You'll see the difference immediately in the way the gods stand, Indian gods tending to dance, Egyptian gods absolutely rigid. But above all, as you know, Ganga speaks for spiritual nourishment, spiritual refreshment, in a way that the Nile doesn't. The Nile is, if you like, a very materialist response to the flooding. We say thank you, the Egyptians say thank you for the food it gave. With Ganga, much more is given, and it is for that she too is regarded as divine. And here we are really in one of those moments where Coomaraswamy would have thought this is a universal. Round the world, the divine river is in a strange way making a comeback in the consequence of the green movement. The attempts to give rivers the modern equivalent of divinity, which would be legal personality and a right to sue, is now being pursued in many countries, both in Canada and in New Zealand. There are now rivers long sacred to the local population, which have been recognized by the courts as being personalities in law who need to be respected and can defend their rights and demand to be honored. It's one of the things we hope will come out of these conversations around these objects, that these ideas are not just common long ago, but have striking resonances in the current world. If we face the other way across Varaha, you can see in the background Sekhmet, the daughter of the sun god Ra, the great Egyptian god. And like Varaha, like this statue, it's about, again, cosmic order, cosmic control, but in this case, to do with disease. Sekhmet is a very sinister lady. She is the oldest object in the Rotunda. She's about 1350 BCE, and a magnificent, slender block of a form of granite, as she stands holding the papyrus, the symbol of prosperity and good fortune. She is the daughter of Ra, and he sends her when the people on earth become troublesome. He sends her to kill them, which she does with gusto and enjoys it more and more until eventually she can't be stopped. And so in order that the world should not perish completely, they decide to trick her, and they flood the whole of Egypt with beer, which they dye red. She thinks it's blood, she drinks it up, she gets drunk, and when she wakes up, she's got over it all and can return to being a perfectly ordinary goddess. And she's the goddess above all of disease. She brings disease, and you need to placate her to avoid disease. And so she is central to the functioning of society. If water gives you life, Sekhmet, properly placated, will keep you alive. She was very important indeed. And we know, in fact, that in almost every museum with an Egyptian collection, there is a Sekhmet, because there was a standing Sekhmet and a seated Sekhmet for every day of the year. So that, by my calculation, comes to 730 Sekhmet statues. Many of them still in Egypt, as you see here, arranged in processional routes. An extraordinary demonstration of the ubiquity of the idea and the power of this goddess in the life of the Egyptians. We wanted to bring this object because it also shows something else, that the stone you have available shapes what you can do with the representation of your god. Egyptian stone is spectacularly hard and difficult to carve. It's almost impossible to show movement, certainly to risk anything like an arm outstretched or anybody trying to dance. Egyptian gods are solemn, static, absolutely terrifying. Whether that's because that's the way they were imagined and then given this form, or whether because this was the only form they could be given, that's how they had to be imagined, is one of the things that I think is worth discussing as we look at the different materials in this exhibition. The fact that she's got a lion head is, again, no surprise in the ancient world at all. And we put on the banner beside her an image of Narasimhi, the female aspect of Vishnu's incarnation as Narasimha, the lion-headed man who, again, kills and destroys, and again becomes very excited by the thrill of the kill. Two forms surprisingly close, with two narratives that have the same underlying theme of the need for the divine power to intervene and the danger of that power getting out of hand unless we make offerings, unless we remember to revere it properly. Turning to the right of the Egyptians, we move into the different world. And the rest of the objects come from what's really a shared cultural world of Greece and Rome. And to start with, the figure of Apollo, the torso that you saw being manhandled a minute ago. He's a son of Zeus, that father figure that we saw at the beginning. And this particular fragment, the torso, a very beautiful one, is clearly a fragment from a particular version of the god Apollo. Like Indian gods, the Greek and Roman gods had various aspects, were seen in various forms, and one of the regular forms shown for Apollo was this one, the Apollo Lycaios. This is the complete version in the Louvre. And it shows him having taken exercise and resting, and with his hand around his head, as you can see, and with his weight heavily on his right leg, and therefore the whole body twisting in two directions. That explains why the arm is up, and it explains that wonderful swing of the body. As you can see, the weight on the left leg, as you look at it, the right leg resting, and the body and the musculature of the body swinging around it. And we put it so that you can see, standing beside it, you can see a cross, and I hope you can see it here, to the Jain figure on the right, the figure of Shantinatha, the 16th Tirthankara, a Jain figure, static, totally under control, totally still, and a completely different conception of what a body infused by divinity might look like. The Apollo here we are, yes. And I think you can see, moving from one to the other, the extraordinary difference in how the body, even when the Indian tradition presents a human body as a human body, the total difference in its assumptions and in the way in which the divine presence is manifested in a human body. The Apollo in this form, the Apollo Lycaios, is called Lycaios because the original version, very famous, stood in Athens in the Lycaon, the word that gives us lycée in French. And Lycaon was one of those great Athenian educational establishments where you went to learn philosophy and to talk about ideas. You also did gymnastics and you did military training. And in the gymnastic end of the Lycaon was this statue of Apollo. And that pulls together all the aspects of Apollo. He is the god of rational balance. He's the god of an intellect that is trained. Aristotle taught in the Lycaon. But as well as training the intellect, you have to train the body. And the perfectly trained body is the symbol of the perfectly trained mind. And, rather more concerningly, of the ethical, moral mind. This beautiful body speaks of a highly ethical, moral soul. And that equivalence between physical beauty and moral greatness runs deep through the Greek tradition and has, I think, been a very dangerous equation for much of history. But it's a very good example of it. And the reason for having your perfect body was not just aesthetic delight in your own workout or the admiration of the opposite sex. It was because you were also being trained to fight. This philosophical democratic society is also a military one. And this body speaks of a certain notion of rational civilization, which is also militarized, and often at war with its neighbors. That idea of Apollo as balance, as I said earlier on, the Greek god, the Roman god, can incorporate only one aspect, really, of human experience and cosmic intervention. The other side is represented by his half-brother, Dionysus. And here is Dionysus. Dionysus, the god of wine above all, but also the god of excess, the god of frenzy, the god of wildness, the god of theatre, the god of many, many of the good things in life that are enjoyed but can get out of control. And we'll come back to this statue in a moment, but for very good reasons, we decided that we had to bring 3 versions of Dionysus to India, because Dionysus is probably the first, either PIO or NRI. It's not at all clear which. But in some of the mythologies, and this would be very difficult for bureaucrats to decide, in some of the mythologies, he's born in India, then goes to live in the Mediterranean, and then comes back to India, and then goes back to the Mediterranean. In others, he's born in the Mediterranean. I shan't bother you with the details of his birth, which are, as you can imagine, fairly complicated and not at all conventional. He's born in the Eastern Mediterranean, comes to India, the land of plenty, the land of wealth, the land of excitement, the land of imagination, and comes back not just with wine, which then transforms the whole of the Mediterranean world, but comes back in triumph with all the abundance that India has to offer. And Dionysus coming back from India in triumph is something that captivates the Greek imagination. And when Alexander marches to India, there's no doubt that one of the things he has in his mind is that this is what Dionysus had done before, and he will also come back in triumph, transformed, enriched, and ennobled by contact with India. It's a very fascinating demonstration in the exhibition, and again, I think it's something that has parallels in the Indian world, of the way the image of a god, the understanding of a god, changes across time. The earliest illustration of Dionysus that we have is on this mixing bowl for wine called a crater, a magnificent Athenian vase from around 520 BC, lent by the Getty. And on it, you can see in the middle the still figure of a man holding a drinking horn, the bearded figure of Dionysus, the god of wine. Now, in the crater, in the mixing bowl, and the reason we call the crater of a volcano a crater is because it's the shape of this bowl. The Greeks always mixed water and wine, so did the Romans, so that you would keep balance and not get too drunk. But with Dionysus, there's always the danger that that will get out of hand. And when it does, what emerges is that humans revert to their animal nature. And so on either side, you can see the satyrs, half man, half horse, with horses' tails, and women running wild. And this is a very interesting bit about Dionysus. The role of women in the ancient world is quite complicated, but they did like to get drunk with Dionysus and have great fun. But then that got out of hand. They run wild, become savage, destroy things. Dionysus and his followers are very risky guests, and you keep it at bay by mixing properly the contents of the water of this bowl. It's a wonderful demonstration of an Athenian vase, and I hope that simply as a great work of art, the students will have time to look very closely at it and to examine it. And it's one of the great triumphs of the advance in transporting possibilities, that it can come and be exhibited in the Rotunda, where there is no air conditioning, all through the monsoon in safety. This is one of the reasons why this exhibition is, I think, such a pioneer, because we've also been exploring how to allow works to move safely across the world and radically different climate conditions. So this, if you like, is the original, the oldest illustration of Dionysus around 520 BC. A couple of hundred years later, he's changed, as you can see, rather radically. He's become much younger. He's become rather glamorous. And he's become much more androgynous. If you look at this beautiful sculpture close up, it's quite hard, and you walk around it, it's quite hard to know whether you're looking from the back, particularly, at a man or a woman. It's wonderfully carved, really worth close examination, and is clearly, is possibly what it was made for. It's very small, and it may well have been made for private use in a house at a symposium, a drinking party, a party where you drank but also discussed philosophy and talked with your friends. And one of the things you would talk about would be the God and the quality of the carving and the fact that you, in Rome, around 50 BCE, know what a great work of art this is. And then back to our later God, our last version of it, the great standing figure of the God holding grapes, with grapes in his hair, the God just on the balance between control and losing control as the drapery begins to slip, but hasn't slipped, and the perfect body, just like his brother Apollo, who's on the other side of the pillars, can be seen and admired. This statue was the cult statue in the temple of Dionysus in Cyrene in Libya. We know quite a lot about where it was, and it was put up somewhere around 150 CE, our era, as a great affirmation on the part of the Roman Empire of the cult of Dionysus and of Bacchus. One of the reasons we wanted to include him is because, very unusually, this statue has got no restoration on it at all. Normally, antique statues got broken, they lost legs, arms, faces, whatever. And in the 18th, 19th century, they were usually put back on. Everything you see here is original, and original of the highest quality. And it's this kind of figure, the standing figure with the magnificent drapery showing the body underneath it, that, of course, you can see just how beautiful the drapery is, and how beautifully the body, again, is modeled. That, of course, is the art the Greeks bring with them when they come to Central Asia under Alexander and after Alexander. This Bodhisattva, which is not much later in date than the Dionysus you've just seen, they both come from the same tradition, a tradition which now becomes a determinant part of the artistic life of the whole of Central Asia and the whole Gandhara world and beyond. And I think you can see very clearly that without the Greco-Roman tradition, this could hardly have been imagined. And you can see it also in the profiles. There's magnificent profile of the Dionysus compared with the profile of the Bodhisattva. The way the nose runs into the eyebrows, the schematization, the control of every element. We're clearly in the same family. This is one world that runs right across the Mediterranean to India. For the Greeks and for the Romans, Dionysus, with wine meant then as now a party, and a party with wine then and now meant women. And Dionysus and Aphrodite go together. The one, you might say, in some measure, leads to the other. And you're looking at one of the most famous statues, one of the most famous images of the ancient world, a version of the statue of Aphrodite, the goddess of love, goddess of passion. She's quite like Dionysus in some ways, that passion can get out of control, but without it, life is hardly worth living, just like with wine. And this first image of Aphrodite naked was made by Praxiteles, the great Greek sculptor, somewhere around 350 BCE, so just before Alexander. Praxiteles is the star of the ancient Mediterranean. The whole world wants works by Praxiteles. And so the island of Kos asked him to do a statue of their protective goddess, Aphrodite. Aphrodite, as you know, the name means born from the foam. The idea was that she was created from the foam of the sea and was swept from the sea to the land, stepped from the water onto the land, and becomes the goddess of love and of passion. She's until now always been shown clothed. Praxiteles, in I think what must be a humorous as well as inventive approach, decides that he'll also show her coming from water to the land, but actually coming from having a bath. And she's naked because she's just had a bath, and you can see the towel beside her and the vase of water. And she's been surprised by somebody catching sight of her. And in that moment of surprise, she attempts to cover herself. It caused a sensation and a scandal. The people of Kos said, no, thank you. We don't want it. This is like ordering a major work from Picasso and then deciding you'll send it back. But the people in the neighboring, nearby, in Turkey, of Knidos, they said, all right, we'll take it. And so she goes to Knidos. And in Knidos, she becomes an enormous success, not just as a cult figure, but as a tourist attraction. They build a special setting for her where you can walk round because she's wonderfully beautiful from every side. And the faithful flock, votaries, devotees flock, but so do tourists. And copy after copy is made of Praxiteles' image. And this one, a very beautiful one, is made in Italy about 150 CE. It's a reduced version and it's made for Rome. And it's one of the interesting things about these sculptures. It's sometimes difficult to know what is a religious sculpture and what is a memento, an echo of a religious sculpture, because, of course, the two overlap. We believe this would be used in Rome, perhaps in a garden, perhaps in a small temple in the garden, but where you would entertain your guests by walking around her, walking past her, and you would show that you were an educated person. The elite of Rome, and it's a very highly educated elite in Rome, they go to Athens, not just to look at classical antiquity, they go to Athens to go to university. It is like going to Oxford or Cambridge, and you want to show you've been there, and you want to know you know how to talk about it all. And so an image like this is a talking point, which is what we hope shall be here as well. You're meant to look at her, to walk round her, to talk about her. You can see when you look closely that the hands and the head are actually 18th century restorations, very beautiful ones. And that is also interesting, that until about the 1830s, it was the norm to add the restoration and give us back the complete version of Praxiteles' Aphrodite. If you look at the very bottom of the plinth, you may see something rather surprising. It looks a little like a plastic label. In fact, it's the most magnificent piece of porcelain made by the Royal Berlin Porcelain Manufacturer. Because when the museum opened in Berlin, that wonderful classical museum, the Altes Museum, in 1830, every piece exhibited had a porcelain label with a number so that you could look it up in your guidebook and inform yourself as you looked and enjoyed the sculpture. And they very thoughtfully and wisely, I think, left it on. This object became, for obvious reasons, the model of feminine beauty. And as you walk round, you can't but admire the way the flesh is rendered, the skill, particularly in different lights. And I think we can all see why Mr. Mukherjee smiled when it was put on the plinth. It became the model of Greek, Roman, European female beauty. And so we put beside it on the banner this image of the wonderful Diraganjakshi from Bihar. The original, it's made about 100 years after the original Aphrodite, somewhere around 250 BCE. And it's a marvelous demonstration of how different cultures construct the ideal of feminine beauty. And the comparison of the two, I think, is well worth pursuing. And you don't need me to point out the completely different set of assumptions about the way the figure is presented, the fact that it's frontal, the fact that it's covered from below the waist. There's nothing coy, there's nothing teasing about the relationship with the spectator as you try to walk round or move round. And the notion of the full form is a very different one from the shape of the Aphrodite in Berlin. But the Aphrodite in Berlin became that model of Praxiteles, the Venus shielding herself, trying to cover herself from gaze, became in Renaissance Italy very famous and became the model of beauty that survives to this day. And as you can see, it's exactly the pose that Botticelli took when he shows the birth of Venus in the late 15th century. He goes exactly from another version that he knew. The Medici had another version of this statue, and he puts her on the shell, being born, coming from the water, this time from the sea, to be born on the land. And that raises, I think, a question that we do want people to consider about how ideals of beauty survive and are shaped by sculpture, and particularly the sculpture that the Greeks and the Romans deployed for their gods. The form of Venus, of Aphrodite, has remained still very much the form, the body shape that many young women across the West want, and not just across the West. And the Apollo has had a similar kind of following across the gymnasia of the world. This body form has become part of the way we think of what we ought to be, not spiritually, not religiously, but as bodies. And it's easy to forget the other side of this body form, which was the military. And we wanted to include in the exhibition two of the wonders of the ancient world, two of the seven wonders of the ancient world. The temple of Artemis at Ephesus, which has got the lion's head here, and this frieze, this magnificent frieze from the mausoleum at Halicarnassus, the tomb of Mausolus, built in his lifetime to show his importance. But this magnificent frieze of Greeks fighting Amazon women. You can see, I think, without my needing to remind you, how closely these bodies are related to the bodies of Apollo, to the bodies that were being trained in the Lycaon in Athens. The perfect training of the young man is so that the young man can go and fight for in wars, often wars of aggression. And here seen fighting the legendary Amazonian women. Greek society gave very little role and very little power to women. They were essentially there to look after the family. But one of the things that shook the Greeks, disturbed them in the Middle East and beyond, and in Africa, was societies where women had real political power. In Sudan, south of Egypt, they encountered women who were queens. The same in the lands to the east of Syria, where it was perfectly normal for women to have political power. And in the Persian Empire, under which this is built, in about 350 BCE, there are women in very high positions. One of the admirals of the Navy is a woman. So for the Greeks, this is very disturbing. If you're trying to construct the other, one of the ways you know somebody is other is that women play a major part in their political life. One of the objections that the Greeks always made to the Persians in the propaganda was that they were effeminate. And the ultimate, of course, in being effeminate is, I suppose, actually just to be a woman. Here, the Amazonians are fighting hard, and you can see the wonderful rendering of the brutality of this conflict as the Greeks fight the other in all its forms. And particularly the brutality, well, on both sides, the brutality with which the woman is being attacked and driven down. The striking thing about this, I think, is the challenge the artist has set himself to show that this scene of almost unbearable cruelty, the more you look at it, can be a thing of great beauty. And in this one slab of the frieze from the monument, he's shown you on the left a perfect triangular composition, that all this can be contained inside a triangle. And on the right, all this can be contained in a square. It's an extraordinary play of the aesthetic against the affective, the horrifying being made beautiful and admirable. And I want to show you one detail, and again, it's the sort of reason why the thing is so important to have. If you look at the detail of the hand of the Amazon bottom left, when you look at it closely, there's a hole in it to show that she actually was holding a sword. This lady is going down fighting. She's going to fight to the end. This monument was built as part of the tomb of Mausolus that he built for himself. And it is itself a combination of the Persian and the Greek world. He was a king in Turkey, Western Turkey, which is now Western Turkey, but paying tribute to the Persian great king in Persepolis. And so the base of his tomb has a high plinth, just like Persian tombs. But above it, he has brought Greek sculptors. We know Greek craftsmen came to work on it, to show that he is also part of a world that is Greek and thinks like the Greeks about the world beyond. It's a marvelous demonstration of cultures in contact, unresolved. And one of the things that I hope will be very possible here, when it's here, is to have different discussions about what is actually going on here. We've always read this from the Western Mediterranean view of the Greeks fighting the other. It also now, of course, has a gender resonance, which is of great importance. But what does it look like from another point of view? How else could one read this? How did they read it is part of the question. The Mausolus and his tomb brings us to really where I want to finish, because it's where we all finish, which is the idea of death and how the different cultures conceive of death and what happens to the body and to the spirit, the soul, after death. For this world, the physical remains of the dead were very important. And this is designed in his lifetime by him to house his ashes. They cremated, but the ashes were kept. And we know that his sister, who was also his queen, Artemisia, was so saddened by his death that for a long time afterwards, she added a little bit of his ashes to her drink now and then so that she could stay close to him. The physical remains were very important. Not, I think, the way in which Indian civilizations imagine the relationship between the dead body, the spirit, and the ongoing existence of the individual as a body or as a spirit. Later on, the Roman world moved almost entirely to a habit of burying the body. Like the Egyptians, where the body is what holds the identity, you, the essential you, and it's the body in the afterlife that's going to matter. The preserving of the body becomes important. And so just as Mausolus needs a tomb, the Romans from the 2nd century CE need coffins. And the preservation of the body in the coffin is one of the big distinctions between Mediterranean culture of late antiquity and Indian traditions, and one I hope that will lead to many discussions. And what you're looking at is a particularly sad and poignant object. It's the coffin bought by parents for a dead young girl. A girl, the scale of the coffin tells us she can hardly have been more than about 10 or 11. And on it, they have chosen to represent the life that she didn't have. The hope for any rich young Roman girl would be that she would marry well, and have children and bring them up well. A fairly conventional Western view of woman. That couldn't happen. She couldn't marry because she died too young. And so on the front, you see the legend, the myth of the marriage of Cupid and Psyche. Cupid, the god of love, the son of Venus, Aphrodite, is attracted to the mortal Psyche. Psyche falls in love with him, and she's eventually taken to live with the gods, and they live happily ever after. Psyche, in Roman terms, makes what we would all describe, I think, as a very good marriage. She winds up in heaven with the god. Here she is with her wings to show that she's now a spirit, and embracing Cupid on the couch. And to left and to right, the same figures, Cupid and Psyche, both playing music. And all around, people bringing in gifts of food, but also of animals that are the talk of love and of children, the hare, the rabbits, the doves. This is the dream that couldn't be fulfilled in life, is going to be fulfilled in sculpture. And this touching image of the dead girl as Psyche, playing her instrument, making music forever in heaven. It's a very poignant and a very appropriate way, I think, to end the walk around the exhibition, because it brings us back also to the fact that this was made for parents because they wanted their daughter to have the fullest life they could imagine. And the whole purpose of this exhibition is, as I said at the beginning, for the young. It is to let the young Indian students see, study, enjoy, understand these great things. I've shown you here school children, but we're hoping that there will also be, that the CSMVS is planning, a remarkable university set of programs so that university students can engage with these objects, and through them, and by comparison with what's happening in the Indian Sculpture Gallery, with all kinds of questions about India's place in the ancient world. And so it's, I think, very appropriate that in the middle of the Rotunda and on the, leading the Varaha is the figure of Saraswati. That is really what this project is about. It is, we hope, a very beautiful exhibition, but it's also a collection of objects designed to provoke conversation and to expand understanding. I was going to end there because it's obviously where I should end, and I'd constructed a little peroration on that. And then I thought I can't resist showing you really the most remarkable thing I have seen since I came to India this time. To do with this exhibition, to do with understanding, and it is, of course, the city bus, the Museum on Wheels, which is taking this exhibition and the ideas in this exhibition out of Mumbai to all parts of Maharashtra and beyond. And I was lucky enough, with other colleagues from the British Museum, from Berlin and from the Getty, to travel with the bus on Friday. And we went to a village near Alibag. You can see the objects from the exhibition are on the side of the bus. And the response was quite extraordinary. When you get inside the bus, there are showcases, and in the showcases are replicas of objects which they will find, you may find in the exhibition. In front of those objects, teaching takes place, and I've rarely seen greater levels of engagement, wonderment, and enjoyment. And it reminds us all that all this is really for the future, and it's never, ever too young to start. Thank you very much.